At 56 years old, Roselyn Halverson should have been climbing in a bed in her own apartment after another long day at a job she'd given 28 years of her life to. Instead, a single morning meeting in a glass conference room left her with a cardboard box, a final paycheck, and a long stretch of dark highway ahead of her. While the world she'd built her whole adult life around shut its doors behind her, Rosie did something nobody who knew her would have predicted. She got in her car and drove 4 hours into the West Virginia hills to a roadside diner her mother had owned, a diner that had been closed and locked and forgotten for 8 straight years. Everyone who knew that stretch of Route 19 assumed the building was rotting from the inside out, that the cracked vinyl booths had long gone to mice, that the place was waiting for a wrecking ball. But when Rosie's headlights swung around the last bend before the gravel lot, she saw something that made her foot lift off the gas and her hands go cold on the wheel. The sign was still lit. Mama Idalia's Roadside, glowing soft and pink against the black hills, the way it had glowed every night of Rosie's childhood, the way it had no earthly business glowing now. What she would find inside that diner, what her mother had quietly arranged years before her death, and what Rosie would build on Route 19 the months that followed, would bring strangers from 3 states to a little town nobody had ever heard of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Roselyn Halverson, who everyone except her late mother had called Rosie since the 2nd grade, had worked at the same regional logistics company in Charleston, West Virginia, for 28 years. She was a senior accounts coordinator. The job was not glamorous. It involved spreadsheets, vendor calls, freight schedules, and the kind of detail work that nobody noticed unless you got it wrong. Rosie almost never got it wrong. She'd started there in 1997 as a 28-year-old single woman with a community college certificate and a pair of sensible shoes, and she'd stayed because the company had been good to her in the early years, and because she was the kind of person who, once she put her hand to something, did not let go of it. She lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the river. She had a tabby cat named Biscuit. She read paperback mysteries on her lunch break. On Sunday afternoons, she drove out to the cemetery in Hollow Creek and sat by her parents' headstones for an hour, sometimes with coffee from the gas station and sometimes with nothing but her hands folded in her lap. Her father, Bowen Halverson, had been gone for 19 years. Her mother, Idalia, had been gone for 8. Rosie had no children, no siblings, no husband. The job was, in a way she had never said out loud to anyone, the closest thing she had to a family. So when Tobias Renfrew, the HR director who'd been at the company for less than 2 years, called her into the small glass conference room on a Tuesday morning in early March, Rosie did not see it coming. He had a folder. A young woman from corporate she'd never seen before sat next to him with a laptop open. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the long table. Tobias smiled the way people smile when they're about to do something difficult and want you to make it easy for them. "Rosie," he said, "thanks for coming in. Why don't you have a seat?" She sat. She set her coffee on the table. He talked for a while. The company was restructuring. The role of senior account coordinator was being absorbed into a broader operations function. They were grateful for her years of service. They had prepared a generous severance package, 12 weeks of pay, and 3 months of continued health coverage, and someone from the office would be available to help her clean out her desk by end of day. He slid the folder across the table. He had a pen ready. Rosie stared at the folder. 28 years, she said. "I know," Tobias said, "and I want you to know how much we appreciate that." She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She read every page of the folder slowly, asked one question about the Cobra paperwork, signed where they told her to sign, and walked back to her desk on legs that did not feel like her own. The young woman from corporate followed her with a laptop, watching her clear out drawers. Rosie packed her things into a banker's box. A framed photograph of Biscuit. A coffee mug from the 1999 company picnic. A cardigan she kept on the back of her chair for cold afternoons. A small ceramic frog her mother had given her. She left her ID badge on the desk. She walked past the cubicle she'd walked past every workday since Bill Clinton was in his 2nd term, and nobody looked up because nobody had been told yet, and by the time they were told, Rosie would be gone. in the parking lot, sitting in her 10-year-old Toyota with the box on the passenger seat, she finally let herself feel it. Not all of it, just the first wave. The way the morning light hit the windshield. The way her hands were shaking too hard to put the key in the ignition. The way the building she'd walked into thousands of times suddenly looked like a building that had nothing to do with her at all. She drove home. She let Biscuit out of the bedroom. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time without taking her coat off. And then she remembered the diner. Rosie did not sleep that night. She lay on top of the covers in her work clothes with Biscuit curled against her hip, listening to the refrigerator hum and the upstairs neighbor's television leak through the ceiling. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and made tea she did not drink. Around 5, she opened her laptop and logged into her work email, more out of habit than purpose, and saw that her access had already been cut off. That was the first small cruelty. The clean efficiency of it. She had walked out of the building at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, and by the time she got home and fed the cat, somewhere in a server room, a person she would never meet had clicked a button and erased her from the system she'd helped build. 28 years, gone in the time it took to send a text message. The second cruelty arrived later that morning, when she finally worked up the nerve to call her old friend Brenda from the accounting team to talk about what had happened. Brenda answered on the second ring, and her voice did the thing voices do when a person already knows. "Oh, honey," Brenda said, "I'm so sorry. You knew." "Not until this morning. They sent out the email at 8. "What did the email say?" There was a pause. Rosie could hear Brenda breathing, choosing her words. "It said you had decided to retire. That after 28 years of service, you were stepping down to spend more time with family. There's a card going around the office. Janelle is collecting signatures." Rosie sat very still on her kitchen chair. "I didn't retire, Brenda." "I know you didn't. I didn't decide anything." "I know." She thanked Brenda for telling her. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table while Biscuit wound around her ankles and waited to be fed. The morning light was the same morning light that had hit her windshield the day before. The world was still arranging itself the way it had always arranged itself. The only thing that had changed was that Rosie no longer had a place inside it. She forced herself to eat half a piece of toast. She made a list of phone calls she needed to make. She called the bank to ask about her mortgage, called the health insurance office to verify her coverage, called the unemployment office, and waited on hold for 40 minutes before being told she was eligible to file but would not see a check for at least 3 weeks. The woman on the phone was kind. The woman on the phone was the only kind voice Rosie heard all day. That afternoon, she opened LinkedIn, which she had not touched in over a decade. She updated her job title to read "Open to Opportunities" and stared at it for 10 minutes before changing it back. She went on the company website, which she still had bookmarked, and found that her name had been scrubbed from the staff directory. In the place where her photo and her bio used to sit, there was a new headshot. A young woman in a blazer. Skyla Beaumontier, operations specialist. The bio said Skyla had joined the company in November of last year. November. 4 months ago. Rosie stared at the screen. She thought about all the time Skyla had stopped by her desk in the last 4 months. The questions about the vendor portal. The questions about the freight reconciliation reports. The friendly little chats about the office printer and where to find good coffee on the 3rd floor. Rosie had thought she was being helpful. Rosie had been training her replacement, and nobody had bothered to tell her. She closed the laptop. The rest of that week passed in a blur Rosie could not later remember in any detail. She knew she paid her rent. She knew she went to the grocery store and bought rice and canned soup, because those were the things her mother had always bought when money was uncertain. She knew she did not return the calls from 2 of her former co-workers who left voicemails saying how shocked they were and how sorry, because she did not want to hear any more sorry voices from any more people who had kept her in the dark. By Friday, she had cried twice, both times in the bathroom with the water running so the neighbors would not hear. By Saturday, she had stopped crying entirely, which felt worse. On Sunday, she drove to the cemetery. She brought 2 cups of gas station coffee, the way she always did, and she set one on her father's headstone and one on her mother's. She sat in the cold grass between them. She told them what had happened. She told them about Tobias Renfrew and the folder and the framed photograph of Biscuit in the banker's box. She told her mother that she did not know what to do, that her bank account had 4 months of careful living in it, and after that nothing, that she was 56 years old and the world had decided she was finished. The wind moved through the cemetery. A crow called from the pines at the far end. Rosie sat with her hands wrapped around the second cup of coffee and watched the steam come up through the cold air. "Mama," she said out loud, "I don't know where I'm supposed to go." She did not get an answer. She had not expected one. But sitting there in the grass with the wind in the pines, she remembered something her mother used to say at the end of bad days at the diner when the dishwasher broke or a customer walked out without paying. "When the world don't want you, baby, the road always does." Rosie put her hand on her mother's headstone. She stood up slowly. She walked back to her car. That night, she packed a suitcase. She did not pack much. 2 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, a stack of underwear and socks, her toothbrush, the cardigan from her desk, the framed photograph of Biscuit. She put Biscuit himself in the carrier on the passenger seat with a towel and a small bowl of water. She put the banker's box from the office in the trunk. She put her mother's old apron, the one she had kept folded in a drawer for 8 years and never been able to throw away, on top of the box. She left her apartment at 4 in the morning. She had not given notice to her landlord. She had not told a single person where she was going. She had $312 in her wallet and a checking account with enough in it to keep her afloat through May if she was careful. And after that, she had nothing but a severance check that had not yet cleared and a hope that was less a hope than a stubbornness. The drive from Charleston to Hollow Creek was 4 hours on a good day. Rosie took 6. She stopped twice for gas and once at a rest area to let Biscuit out of the carrier and walk him on a leash she had bought years ago and never used. The cat was furious. The cat had not been in a car since the day she had brought him home from the shelter as a kitten, and he yowled at her for 40 minutes straight before finally curling up in the towel and going silent. The route took her south first, then east, off the interstate and onto Route 19, which was a 2-lane state road that climbed up into the hills and twisted along ridge lines and dropped into hollows where the cell signal cut out for miles at a time. It was a road Rosie had not driven in 8 years. Not since the day after her mother's funeral, when she had driven up to Hollow Creek to meet with a lawyer about the diner and the small house behind it, and had signed the papers that closed the diner and put the house under a property management company that collected a token rent from a tenant Rosie had never met. She had not been back since. She had told herself she would come up on weekends to check on things. She had told herself she would think about what to do with the diner once she had time. The years had gone by, and the time had never come, and the diner had sat dark on Route 19 for 8 straight winters while Rosie sat at her desk in Charleston building freight schedules for a company that, as it turned out, had been planning to throw her away for at least 4 months. The light was beginning to fail by the time she came over the last ridge before Hollow Creek. The hills here were soft and old, rounded by 100 million years of rain, and the road wound between them in long, gentle curves that Rosie's hands remembered before her mind did. Her grandfather had driven these curves in a green pickup truck. Her father had driven them in a brown station wagon with wood paneling on the side. Rosie had ridden in the back seat as a child and watched the same trees go by, and now here she was driving them herself, alone, with a cat in a carrier and a banker's box in the trunk. She did not know what she would find at the diner. She had not let herself think about it. The property management company had stopped collecting rent 6 years ago when the last tenant moved out, and Rosie had never replaced him. The building had sat empty, probably leaking, probably with mice, probably with the kind of slow rot that takes a place down from the inside until one day the roof falls in and nobody notices. She came around the last bend at 9:15 at night, and she saw the sign. It was glowing. The pink neon script that had been there since 1971, Mama Idalia's Roadside, flickering softly against the dark hill behind it. Glowing the way it had glowed on every Friday night of Rosie's childhood, when her father pulled the station wagon into the gravel lot, and she ran across the parking lot in her sneakers to the front door. Glowing the way it had glowed the night her mother had closed the diner at age 67, because her hands had finally given out from 40 years of waitressing, and the way it had glowed the morning 2 weeks later when her mother had a stroke in the kitchen behind the counter and never woke up. Rosie pulled into the gravel lot and stopped the car. She left the headlights on. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel and stared at the sign through the windshield. It should have been dark. The electric had been shut off. She had signed the paperwork herself. The diner had been closed for 8 years. The sign was lit. Biscuit yowled in the carrier. The sound brought her back to herself. She turned off the engine. She got out of the car slowly, the way a person gets out of a car at the scene of an accident, and she stood in the gravel lot with the cold air on her face and looked up at her mother's name in pink neon against the West Virginia sky. There were no other cars in the lot. The windows of the diner were dark. The front door, when she walked up to it and pulled on the handle, was locked. But the sign was lit, soft and warm and impossible. Lit for her. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked back to the car, opened the trunk, and took out the banker's box. She slept in the car that first night. She did not have the key to the diner anymore. She had given it to the property management company 8 years ago and never asked for it back. The little house behind the diner, where her parents had lived for 43 years, was locked too, and the spare key her mother had always kept under the third flower pot on the back porch was not there when Rosie checked. So she reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, draped her coat over herself, and let Biscuit out of the carrier to curl up on her chest. The cat was warmer than the coat. The sign hummed softly above the parking lot. Rosie watched the pink light bleed across the windshield and tried not to think about how cold the car would be by morning. She woke at dawn with a cramp in her neck and the cat sitting on her bladder. She got out, walked Biscuit on the leash along the edge of the gravel lot, and looked at the diner in the daylight for the first time in 8 years. It was worse than she had let herself imagine. The white paint on the siding was peeling in long curls. One of the front windows had a crack running corner to corner. The gutter on the south side had pulled away from the roof and was hanging at an angle. Weeds had come up through the gravel of the parking lot in green tufts. The screen door at the back had rusted halfway off its hinges and was banging gently in the wind. But the sign was still lit. She walked around the back of the building to the little house. It had a covered porch, and on the porch was a wooden bench her father had built in 1982. Rosie sat down on the bench. The wood was damp. The cushion her mother had sewn for was long gone, probably eaten by mice, probably composted into the floorboards. Rosie sat anyway. She put her face in her hands and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had driven 4 hours to a place where she had no key, no plan, no electricity she had paid for, no running water she could verify, and not one person in the world who knew where she was. She was 56 years old. She had a cat and a banker's box and a frozen feeling in her chest that she could not name. After a while, she got up. She walked back to the car. She took her phone out of the cup holder and called the property management company, and a woman she had never spoken to before answered on the fourth ring and looked up Rosie's file and confirmed that yes, the keys to the property were in the office safe, and yes, Rosie could pick them up that morning if she could drive in a Beckley. Beckley was 40 minutes away. Rosie drove there with Biscuit yowling on the seat beside her, picked up a small manila envelope from a young receptionist who seemed faintly surprised that the property's owner existed, and drove back to Hollow Creek. She had not stopped for food. She had $8 and change in her wallet now, and she did not yet know how she was going to make it last. She let herself into the diner at noon. The smell hit her first. Stale, dry, dusty, the particular smell of a building that has been closed up for years with all of its history sealed inside it. The cooking grease in the air had gone rancid and then settled, mixing with mouse droppings and dust and the faint sweetness of mildew from somewhere along the back wall. Rosie stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Underneath the rot, almost gone but not quite, was something else. Coffee. The ghost of 40 years of coffee, soaked into the wood and the vinyl, refusing to leave. The booths were exactly as her mother had left them. Red vinyl, cracked in places, the tables wiped clean for the last time 8 years ago and never touched since. The counter had 8 stools, all of them still in place. The chrome napkin dispensers her father had bought at an estate sale in 1979 were lined up in a perfect row. Behind the counter, the pass-through window into the kitchen was empty, dark, waiting. Rosie walked the length of the dining room slowly. Her sneakers left prints in the dust on the floor. She ran her fingers along the counter, and they came up gray. She passed the table she and her father used to sit at when she was 9 years old, doing her math homework while her mother worked the lunch shift. She passed the booth where her parents had sat together every night at closing, drinking the last pot of coffee and counting the receipts. In the kitchen, she found her mother's apron still hanging on the hook by the walk-in cooler. White stained, faded, folded once, and hung neatly the way her mother always hung it. Rosie took it down. She held it to her face. It did not smell like her mother anymore. It smelled like dust. But the shape of it in her hands was exactly the way she remembered, and she stood there in the dim kitchen holding the apron to her face, and finally, she cried. She cried until her shoulders ached. She cried for her mother and her father and the apartment in Charleston and the cat in the carrier in the car and the 28 years and the framed photograph of Biscuit and the woman named Skyla Beaumonier who had asked her where to find good coffee on the 3rd floor. When she was done, she put the apron on. She tied it behind her back. She walked back out to the car, brought Biscuit and the banker's box inside, and started looking for a broom. That was the first day. The broom was in the supply closet behind the kitchen, exactly where her mother had always kept it, with a dustpan leaning against the wall beside it, and a stack of clean rags on the shelf above. The bristles were stiff. The handle was the same dented wooden handle Rosie remembered from when she was 12, and her mother had paid her a quarter to sweep the back stoop on Saturday mornings. She started at the front door and worked her way back. The dust came up in clouds. 8 years of it settled into every corner, every booth, every gap between the floorboards. She swept until her shoulders hurt and her eyes burned, and then she went out to the car for a bottle of water and a granola bar from the glove compartment, and then she came back in and swept some more. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the end of the first afternoon, she had a pile of dust and trash in the middle of the dining room the size of a basketball. By the end of the second afternoon, she had hauled 6 garbage bags of debris out to the dumpster behind the building, which to her amazement was still in place though no garbage truck had visited it in years. By the end of the third afternoon, she had wiped down every booth, every table, every surface of the counter, and she had scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees with a bucket of water she had carried in from the spigot behind the little house. The water still worked. That was a small miracle. The well pump came on when she turned the faucet, and the water that came out, after running brown for 10 minutes, ran clear. The electricity worked too, which was the bigger miracle, the one she could not explain. The lights came on when she flipped the switches. The walk-in cooler hummed when she plugged it in, even though it was empty. The neon sign out front had been glowing for 8 years. The bills were being paid by someone, somewhere, and Rosie had not yet sat down to figure out who. On the 4th morning, while she was on her knees scrubbing the legs of the counter stools, a pickup truck pulled into the gravel lot. She stood up slowly. She wiped her hands on the apron. She watched through the front window as an old man got out of the driver's side, very slowly, and stood looking at the diner for a long moment before he walked toward the door. He was tall and thin and stooped, with a gray beard and a brown canvas coat. He took off his cap when he saw her through the window. Rosie did not recognize him at first, and then she did, and her hand went to her mouth. She opened the door. "Mr. Tatemore," she said. "Rosie Halverson," he said. "Lord have mercy. I thought I was seeing a ghost." Cyrus Tatemore had been her mother's line cook for 31 years. He had stood at the grill behind the pass-through window from 1976 until the day Mama, Idalia, closed the diner in 2017. Rosie had not seen him since the funeral. He had been 72 then. He was 80 now. He looked smaller than she remembered, but his eyes were the same. "I drove past last night," he said, "on my way back from my niece's place in Summersville. Saw a car in the lot. Saw the lights on inside." He paused. Hadn't seen a car in this lot in 8 years. She did not know what to say to him. She stood in the doorway with the dirty apron and the bucket of gray water at her feet and felt the 8 years between them all at once. He looked at her for a long moment. "Your mama said you'd come back," he said. "She told me, the year before she went. She said one day Rosie's going to come back to this diner. She told me to keep an eye on the place if I was still around when it happened." Rosie's throat closed up. "Why is the sign on, Cyrus?" He looked past her into the dim dining room, at the booths and the counter and the dust she had not yet finished sweeping out from under them. He looked at the apron on her body, her mother's apron, white and stained and creased from where it had been folded for 8 years. "That's a long conversation," he said. "Maybe sit down for it." She let him in. She made coffee on a hot plate she had found in the back, using grounds from a can in the pantry that were probably 6 years past their freshness date, but tasted, to her, like the best coffee she had ever made. They sat in the booth her parents used to sit in. Cyrus put his cap on the table. He wrapped his hands around the mug. "Your mama set up a little arrangement," he said. "Year before she passed. She didn't tell anybody. She had a small life insurance policy that paid out in a particular way, and she set it up so the electric and the property tax on this place would be paid every month for 10 years. He looked at her. "She told me she didn't want the place going dark. She said if it stayed lit, somebody would come back to it. Somebody would need it." Rosie stared at him. 10 years, she said. 2 more left on it, Cyrus said. "After that, it's on you." She sat with her hands around the coffee mug. The light from the front window came in through the dust, still hanging in the air, turning it gold. Cyrus drank his coffee. He waited. Outside, a truck rattled past on Route 19 and faded into the hills. "What do you want to do, Rosie?" he asked. She thought for a long time. "I want to open it," she said. Cyrus came back the next morning at 6. He did not call ahead. He pulled into the gravel lot in his pickup truck, came in through the back door with a paper bag of biscuits from a place in Somersville and a thermos of coffee that was better than anything Rosie had managed to make on the hot plate. He set the bag on the counter. He took off his cap. He put on the spare apron her mother had always kept on the second hook by the walk-in cooler. He did not say much. He walked the kitchen the way a man walks through a house he used to live in. He opened the walk-in. He checked the gas line on the grill, which had been shut off years ago, and showed Rosie how to relight the pilot once the propane company came out to refill the tank. He ran his hand along the edge of the prep counter and shook his head at the layer of grease still clinging to the underside of the hood. "We got 2 weeks of work in here before you can serve a single egg," he said. "Maybe 3. I don't have the money to pay you, Cyrus." He looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Did I ask?" He worked beside her for the next 12 days. 6 in the morning until dark, with a break at noon for whatever Rosie could scrape together from the pantry. He did not take a single dollar. When she pushed him about it on the 4th day, he set down the wrench he was using on the dishwasher and looked at her flat and said, "Your mama gave me a job in 1976 when I was a 27-year-old man with a baby on the way and a felony on my record, and nobody else in this county would hire me. She paid me fair every week for 31 years. She buried my wife when I couldn't afford the funeral. You think I'm going to take money from her daughter?" Then he picked the wrench back up and went back to the dishwasher, and Rosie did not bring it up again. On the 8th day, while she was clearing out the bottom drawer of the desk in the little office behind the kitchen, she found the ledger. It was a green cloth-bound notebook, the kind sold at every drugstore in America for 50 years, with the words "Record Book" stamped on the cover in faded gold. It was sitting at the very bottom of the drawer, under a stack of old vendor receipts and a dried-out checkbook for 1998. Rosie pulled it out. She sat down at the desk. She opened it. The first entry was dated April 14th, 1978. Donnie M. Trucker out of Bluefield, blown engine, nowhere to sleep. 2 eggs, sausage, biscuit, coffee. Caught in the back room 2 nights. Walked out April 16th. The next entry was a week later. Woman with 2 kids ran from her husband in Beckley. Pancakes for the kids. Coffee for her. $50 from the till. Bus station in Charleston. Rosie turned the page. There were entries on every line. Some short, some long. Names she did not recognize. Hot meals given away. Money slipped across the counter. A pair of shoes once for a man whose own had given out on the road. A jacket for a girl in February. The handwriting was her mother's, the same careful slanted print Rosie remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. The ledger went on for 40 years. She turned page after page. Some week her mother had given away 2 meals. Some weeks she had given away a dozen. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before her mother's stroke. Boy, maybe 19, hitchhiking south. Wouldn't say his name. Cheeseburger and fries, slice of pie. $20 in his coat pocket while he was washing his hands. Hope he gets where he's going. Rosie sat with a ledger open in her lap. She thought about the diner she had grown up in. The way her mother had always seemed to be feeding someone who was not quite a paying customer. The way certain people came in and ordered nothing and left full anyway. The way her mother had always said the same thing when Rosie asked about it as a child. Hush, baby. We don't keep score. But she had kept score. She had kept it in a green notebook in the bottom drawer of the desk for 40 years in her own private hand, where nobody but her would ever see it. Rosie closed the ledger. She put it on the desk. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and went to find Cyrus. He was on a stepladder in the dining room, replacing the bulb in the fixture over booth 4. She held up the ledger. Did you know about this? He climbed down. He looked at the cover of the notebook. He looked at her. I knew she did it, he said. I didn't know she wrote it down. 2 days later, on a cold gray afternoon, when Rosie was painting the trim of the front window, a girl walked out of the trees on the far side of Route 19 and crossed the road and stood in the gravel lot. She looked maybe 20. She was wearing a hooded sweatshirt that was too thin for the weather and carrying a backpack that looked too heavy for her shoulders. Her hair was dirty. Her face was hollowed out in a way Rosie recognized without being able to name. The girl stood in the middle of the lot for a long time, looking at the lit sign before she walked up to the door. You open? She asked. Rosie set down the paintbrush. Not yet, she said. But come in. I've got coffee on. The girl's name was Lana Vance. She had been walking for 9 days. Lana did not say much that first afternoon. She sat at the counter on the third stool from the end and drank 2 cups of coffee and ate a bowl of canned chicken soup that Rosie warmed on the hot plate. Her hand shook when she lifted the spoon. She kept the backpack between her feet under the stool, the way a person keeps a thing when they have learned to never put it down. Rosie did not ask questions. She remembered her mother's ledger. She remembered the entry from April of 1978 and the woman with 2 kids and the boy hitchhiking south. She poured a 3rd cup of coffee and slid the sugar across the counter and let the girl eat in peace. After the soup, Linnea wiped her mouth on the napkin and sat looking at the empty bowl for a long minute. How much do I owe you? She said. Nothing. I have $4. Keep it. The girl looked up. Her eyes were the kind of eyes Rosie had seen before, on her own face, in the bathroom mirror at 4 in the morning the week of the layoff. I can wash dishes, Linnea said. I can sweep. Whatever you need. I just need a few days. I'll move on. Rosie thought about it for about 3 seconds. There's a back room behind the kitchen, she said. It has a cot in it. The bathroom in there works. You can stay until you figure out where you're going. Linnea stayed 3 weeks. She did wash dishes. She swept. She turned out to know a little about plumbing, of all things, and helped Cyrus replace the trap under the second sink in the kitchen on a morning when Rosie had given up on it. She did not talk about where she had come from, and Rosie did not press her. On the 10th day, she told Rosie, without being asked, that she was 21 and from a town in Ohio, and that she had left because her stepfather was the kind of man who made staying impossible. That was all she said. Rosie nodded. They did not speak of it again. The diner opened on a Saturday morning in early April, 6 weeks after Rosie had pulled into the gravel lot with Biscuit in the carrier and a banker's box in the trunk. There was no grand opening sign. There was no ad in the paper. Cyrus made the first pot of coffee at 5:30 in the morning. Rosie put on her mother's apron. Linnea set out the napkin dispensers along the counter the way Rosie had shown her. The first customer was a trucker named Buck Ainsworth who pulled his rig into the lot at 6:15, looked at the lit sign and the lit windows for a full minute before he killed the engine, and then walked in and sat down at the counter and said, well, I'll be damned. When did this place come back? Cyrus poured him a cup of coffee. Buck ordered 2 eggs over easy, sausage, hash browns, biscuit. He paid in cash. He left a $5 tip on a $9 breakfast. 6 more customers came in that day. The next day, 11. By the end of the second week, word had moved up and down Route 19 the way word moves on a 2-lane state road, by truck radio, and by gas station counter, and by the kind of phone calls neighbors make to neighbors. Mama Idalia's was open again. Mama Idalia's daughter had come back. The diner that everybody had assumed was rotting on the inside was somehow standing up and serving breakfast. Buck Ainsworth, who turned out to drive a regular long-haul route between Charlotte and Cleveland, posted a photograph of his breakfast on his Facebook page. He wrote 4 sentences under the photograph. Mama Idalia's Roadside on Route 19 is open again after 8 years. daughter took it over. Sign was lit the whole time. Turns out the old lady had paid the bill in advance. Best biscuit I've had in a decade. The post went up at 7:30 in the morning. By that afternoon, it had been shared 400 times. By the next morning, 8,000. By the end of the week, a young woman named Marigold Esposito, who wrote feature stories for the Charleston Gazette-Mail, drove the 4 hours up Route 19 with a notebook and a digital recorder and sat in booth 3 for 2.5 hours talking to Rosie. The story ran the following Sunday under the headline "The Sign Was Still Lit." How one woman's layoff brought a beloved roadside diner back from the dead. The story included a photograph of Rosie standing behind the counter in her mother's apron, and a photograph of the green ledger open on the prep counter, and a quote from Cyrus that Rosie did not know he had given until she read it in the paper. Idalia knew her daughter would need this place one day. She just didn't know which day. The story went national 3 days later. People started driving up from Charleston and Beckley and Bluefield to eat breakfast on a Saturday morning. A man drove down from Pittsburgh. A retired couple drove over from Roanoke. A woman in her 60s came in alone on a Tuesday afternoon, ate a slice of pie, and told Rosie at the register that her mother had given her father a meal at this diner in 1983 when his truck broke down outside Hollow Creek. He had been broke and ashamed. Mama Idalia had fed him for free and put him up in the back room for 2 nights. The woman had her father's name written down on a piece of paper. She asked Rosie if she could check the ledger. Rosie checked. The name was there. The woman cried at the register for a long time, and Rosie cried with her, and Cyrus stood at the grill and pretended not to notice. By June, the diner was full every weekend. By August, Rosie had hired a second cook, a woman named Thomason Brock who had been laid off from a hospital cafeteria in Beckley and who could make pancakes the way Rosie's mother had made them, light and a little uneven at the edges. Lana was still there. She had not moved on after 3 weeks the way she had said she would. She had a cot in the back room and a small paycheck and a bank account Rosie had helped her open at the credit union in Summersville, and she was studying for her GED on Tuesday and Thursday nights at the table in the office. Cyrus came in 5 mornings a week. He had told Rosie, in his quiet way, that he was 80 years old and could not stand at a grill the way he used to, but Rosie had told him back that nobody was asking him to stand at the grill, that what she needed was for him to sit at the counter and drink coffee and tell Thomason what Mama Idalia would have done. He agreed to that. He was good at it. The ledger sat on the prep counter, open to a fresh page. Rosie had started writing in it again. The first new entry was dated April 19th, the day the woman from Roanoke had come in with her father's name on a piece of paper. The second was a man who had run out of gas at the pump down the road and been embarrassed about it. The third was a teenage girl who had walked in alone on a Sunday morning with the look Rosie was learning to recognize, and who had eaten a stack of pancakes and left without paying, and Rosie had not chased her down. She had written the girl's description in the ledger in her own slanted print. She had not kept score because her mother had taught her not to keep score, but she had written it down. There was a difference. In late September, a letter came in the mail from the Regional Logistics Company in Charleston. It was on company letterhead. It was signed by a vice president whose name Rosie had never seen before. The letter said that in light of recent changes to the company's restructuring plan, a position had become available that the company believed would be a strong fit for someone with Rosie's experience and institutional knowledge. The salary was higher than what she had been making the day Tobias Renfrew had slid the folder across the conference table. The letter asked her to call. Rosie read it twice. She folded it back into its envelope. She walked out into the dining room, where Cyrus was on his second cup of coffee at the counter, and Linnea was wiping down booth 6, and Buck Ainsworth's rig was idling in the gravel lot waiting for him to finish his eggs. She put the letter in the trash bin behind the register. She did not call. A few days later, she sat at the desk in the little office and worked out on a yellow legal pad what she could afford to do with the diner over the next 2 years. The arrangement her mother had set up had 2 years left on it. After that, the electric bill and the property taxes were going to be Rosie's. She wanted a real walk-in cooler. She wanted the roof patched. She wanted to put a small notice in the front window, the same kind of notice her mother had never put up but had practiced anyway, that said anyone who walked in hungry could eat, no questions asked, and that the bill would be settled later or not at all. She wanted to keep the ledger going. She did the math 3 times. The numbers were tight. The numbers were going to stay tight for a long time. But the numbers worked. That night, after Cyrus had gone home and Lana had finished her GED practice and gone to bed in the back room, Rosie locked the front door and turned off the dining room lights. She left the sign on. She stood for a moment in the dark dining room with only the pink glow from outside coming through the front window, and she thought about the morning in March when Tobias Renfrew had sat across the table from her with a folder and told her how much they appreciated her 28 years. She had thought that morning that she had lost everything. She had thought her life was finished. She had been 56 years old in a parking lot with a banker's box on the passenger seat and a cat in a carrier, and she had not been able to get the key in the ignition because her hand was shaking too hard. Standing in the dark dining room 6 months later, she thought about that woman in the parking lot. She thought about how that woman had been right about one thing. A life had ended that morning in March. A whole 28-year life. The woman in the parking lot had not been wrong to grieve it. But the woman in the parking lot had also been wrong about something. She had thought the ending of that life was the ending of her. It had taken Rosie 6 months and 4 hours of driving and a green ledger in the bottom drawer of a desk to learn that it was not. The thing the company in Charleston had taken from her had been a job. The thing her mother had left her, paid for in advance, and waiting on a dark stretch of Route 19 with a sign her mother had quietly kept lit, had been a life. Rosie put her hand on the counter. She felt the wood under her palm. She walked through the kitchen and out the back door and stood in the gravel lot and looked up at the pink neon spelling out her mother's name against the West Virginia sky. She went to bed. The sign stayed lit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.